ladies and gentlemen, would you please launch off the second debate by warmly welcoming our debate moderator, Mr. David Bender.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the participants in today's debate are first Dr. Will Provine. He's been a professor at Cornell University since 1969, where he is an Andrew H. and James L. Tisch Distinguished University Professor and is in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. He's earned a PhD in the history of science at the University of Chicago, and he's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He is a published author, having written several books, and I believe is currently working on another. Our other participant appearing today is Dr. Andrew McIntosh. He is here in his personal capacity. He holds a chair in thermodynamics and combustion theory in the Energy and Resources Research Institute at the University of Leeds in England. He received first-class honors in applied mathematics from University of Wales, a PhD from Cranfield, and a Doctor of Science from the University of Wales. He has had over 150 publications in journals and conferences, and he has become a fellow in the Institute of Physics in 2002, and in 2003 was elected a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. Now, in compliance with our agreed terms, we'll have the opening statement of Dr. Provine.
Thank you very kindly. Thank you, Jay Lucas, for inviting us to be here. Now, you don't see that many contests between young Earth creationists and evolutionists. Of course, my evolutionist friends say this is a great mistake for me to be here, but I know better. You wonderful guy. We have found a wonderful friendship, and I'm delighted to be here. We do disagree about evolution, and we're going to talk about birds and bats, and it's more fun than a barrel of monkeys. Those who stay around for the second lecture, I'll introduce you to all of my tractors. This is only the latest one, but 20 tons of it. Now, my debate partner, whom I just shook his hand and we exchanged our warmth with each other, he believes that the Earth is very young. And I don't believe that at all, but here is what he says. The basis for my belief, he says, is unashamedly Scripture first. And I admire that. Bingo! I admire that. And boy, does he ever stick to it. He thinks it says it's only 6,000 years. And so, of course, he rejects evolution. How could everything have happened in 6,000 years? It couldn't possibly have happened in 6,000 years. Unfortunately, I believe the Earth is rather old, and we shall see just how that goes. What kind of evidence do we have for the age of the Earth? We drill cores of ice in Greenland and Antarctica, and as you go down and down and down, you can clearly distinguish every single year every single year. And here they are. Those are what the ice cores look like. And in one of them, they have the years marked. Bing, bing, bing. And those years go up to about 100,000. It seems that it's hard to get out of 100,000 years with these ice cores. But I'd love it if I could see you get out of that. But I'm going to carry that argument a little bit further. And what we're going to look at is what happens when you look at the world itself. So what we're going to do, we're going to look and see how the planets, the pieces of land on Earth changed not within the last 6,000 years, but within the last 300 million years. So just look at this. It's really stunning. This is 300 million years ago. We haven't yet gotten to Pangea yet. At the end of the Permian, about 250 million years ago. But I'll stop it there. Oh, not quite. But that's all right. That's close enough. When you get to the end of the Permian, there's a huge extinction, about 90% of species. But that's just the period of time when all the parts of the Earth, land parts, were in Pangea, in one big body, 250 million years ago. Now, watch what happens. How many of you on this map can spot India? Where would it be? Where would India be on this thing? The answer is, dun, 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 that's India right there, right there. Now, where is it going to be? It's going to be up in Asia. All right, watch what happens. This is just a video made by a man named Scoties at the University of Texas, where many people do not believe in evolution. It goes by jumps of 500,000 years each time. Boom, 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 boom. Isn't that incredible? India's still way down there. 70 million years ago, there's another big extinction. And yet, India is still down there 70 million years ago. And then it takes off like a bat. And boom, takes off and goes. Now watch what happens to it. Here, let me stop it at about 70 million years ago. Boom. All right, India's just getting ready to take off. And watch what happens to it. It's going to take right off, crash into Asia, raise up the Himalayas. Oh, wow, is this stuff neat. Zoom. Off takes India. Madagascar stays down on the coast of Africa, but it's been separated from Africa for a long time. North America, South America are separated. Oh man, this is really neat stuff. There it goes. It's just cramming into Asia. Whomp, it goes in there, and up go the Himalayas. Isn't that neat stuff? That, to me, it's worth understanding this to help you to understand evolution. All right, so we're going to move right along. What's Dr. Andy going to tell you? He's going to... I appreciate the answer that he will give you, that God did it. But for me, that doesn't answer anything. And it is hopelessly boring to have it be the answer to everything. It just doesn't do me any good at all. So I wouldn't be in evolutionary biology if I thought every time I looked at a good adaptation that it meant that God did it. I want to hear some different answers that are more interesting than that. So I would say, let's look at birds and bats and see what we can find out about birds and bats. So we're going to do an experiment that you know perfectly well, Dr. Andy. Now, Dr. Andy knows about this experiment, and he knows that I'm right in what I have to say here. But what does he conclude from this? Dr. Will has something different to say. Where in the world did birds get those fancy lungs? I would like a pair of them myself. It would be neat to do mountain climbing if you had bird lungs. And it is wild that God gave them to those damn geese and didn't give them to us. I think that's terrible. Well, where did they get those fancy lungs? And where did we get lesser ones? Remember, it's after the Permian at about 250 million years ago that's the greatest extinction that we've ever had in the history of the Earth. That is, about 90% of species went extinct more in the oceans than on land. But one thing is for darn sure, it was a huge, gigantic extinction, and it took a long time for life to recover from that. There were pre-mammals before that extinction. These reptiles all had breathing in and out, just like we humans do. And that's the problem. So let's look at the extinction. What I want for you to look at particularly is the problem of oxygen levels after the Permian extinction. The oxygen levels were lower than on Mount Everest. Lower than that. And when we were on top of Mount Everest, we were having real problems. And the mammals, the pre-mammals, they were big, a lot of them. They all died out during the low oxygen. And that was a terrible period of time for life in general. To give you some idea of what the oxygen levels were like, take a look at this. I have marked those areas after the Permian extinction where the oxygen levels were extremely low. And that's when a lot of interesting animals and plants developed. They developed then because they found ways of being more efficient about oxygen use. That's not true of the pre-mammals. They never changed, but they got awful small during this period of time because big ones couldn't survive. Well, one branch of reptiles does extremely well. So they all come from archosaurs, and they're crocodiles, dinosaurs, lizard kings, and pterosaurs. Oh my gosh, what wonderful animals. And the lizard kings is something that we haven't really studied that much. It turns out that they dominated the dinosaurs for 30 million years. They're absolutely wonderful looking animals. Take a look at recreations of them. Lizard kings. Ooh, neat. We haven't the slightest idea why the lizard kings lost out to the dinosaurs. We don't know the answer to that. That's a wonderful question, and I just can't give you insight into it. I don't know of any evolutionist in the world who knows why that happened. It's an interesting problem. So, crocodiles, alligators, saurischian dinosaurs, and probably lizard kings all had what? You can guess what it is, a better breathing method. They had a better breathing method. They had one-way breathing. It's the neatest thing in the world. One-way breathing enables you to be really efficient about your breathing. And birds have it. Oh, wow. Saurischian dinosaurs, when they first appear in the fossil record, they have hollow bones and an extra air sac. Bingo, they already got them right from the very beginning, coming out of the low oxygen period. And crocodiles didn't have hollow bones, but they certainly had the extra air sacs. And only in the last year have we come to understand that they have one-way breathing. So we've had all these years in evolutionary biology, and we didn't even know they had one-way breathing until this past year. It's really exciting that we can find these out. So saurischian dinosaurs sport feathers. They have feathers, saurischian dinosaurs, little two-legged dinosaurs running around, and they have feathers on them. And they predate Archaeopteryx, who's the first so-called bird, only it's not really a bird. And more feathered dinosaurs are going to be discovered in future years. There's what one looks like, and the reason why they can give it colors is because they got melanophores off of the darn thing, and they look at those in such a way that they can understand what colors they're associated with. But you know what? I've never trusted dinosaurs to be the colors that evolutionists thought that they were. So that's not, to my mind, that's not crucial. Birds evolved from saurischian dinosaurs. That seems to me to be absolutely clear. So we've got a story here now. You have an evolutionary story that says birds have lungs that evolved from saurischian dinosaurs who succeeded archosaurs in a very crucial period of time of low oxygen. And where does that leave us then? You know, that leaves us with a story of bats and humans sharing their lung systems as mammals. Birds and crocodiles have one-way system of breathing through different means. So as far as I'm concerned, evolutionists have a far more interesting story of birds and bats than merely chanting, no matter how vigorously, that God did it. God did it is the only thing, dear man, that you're really offering. God did it, and did it recently. And I don't think either of those things is true. It's all yours, and you've got 6 extra minutes. He deserves more time because it's much harder to be a creationist than to be an evolutionist.
Okay, if I could, thank you. Thank you, Will. Thank you very much, Pastor Jay. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, David. And thank you, Ryan, Ty, Denova, and Vicky, and all the others who've made this possible. It's a real privilege to be debating such a worthy opponent, and I really do have a great respect for Will. Two things we agree on: music, which he was playing during his presentation, which I really enjoyed. We also have a very serious desire for truth. He is not a postmodernist, and neither, by the way, is Professor Dawkins and many others of a similar persuasion. I have a great respect for their desire for truth. Two things that we're different on: he has more hair than I do. If you look at me, that may be true. And also, of course, on the creation-evolution issue. Let's do some real science. And may I just point out a few things about the UK. We are two countries who are separated by a common language. Think about that. Some education. Your freeways are not free. Try calling the sidewalks pavements, which is what they really are. And your yards, please call them gardens. And for cars, the trunk is what an elephant has, and the hood is a gallant ship that we lost in the war. So please use boot and bonnet respectively. And concerning a little incident in Boston Harbor, let's have our tea back desalinated. Okay, let's get down to real business. I'm not going to be able to deal with everything, which shows that what we've just heard is a lot of just so stories. But I'm going to deal with some of them. I'm going to deal with the aerodynamics of birds, a little bit on alula feathers, and then the morphology and bone structure, and a little bit on the lung. This is a far more logical alternative, Will, than what you've just presented. Dinosaurs and birds were created with no real connection between them. There are similarities, which I don't deny. Bats. I'm not going to say a lot about bats, but of course we both agree, of course they're mammals, warm-blooded, and very different in many ways to other flying creatures. The skeleton of a bat is quite remarkable. It's pendactyl, just like, of course, birds have a pendactyl frame. People try to argue that elephants or shrews became bats, and gradually the appendages between their limbs and their bodies didn't fray, I beg your pardon, but extended and became the surfaces that we now have. Now, that is a very poor argument, because in between, that creature would be the prey for any little predator or big one to pick them off. Charts like this are put in evolutionary textbooks. Suppose transitional changes between a little shrew and a bat. None of them are found in the fossil record whatsoever. Bats in rock, which I'm going to take for the time being the argument that will accept the dates. I don't, as Will has just pointed out, have that view. But it doesn't alter my argument. I'm just going to use the dating system which is classically accepted. But publicly, I don't deny what Will has quoted from my book. That is my position. But for the sake of argument, I'm just going to use the dates that they have. Well, you'll find this is classically dated as 50 million years ago, and bats are exactly the same as today. Now, many of the things that I'm going to say to you are published in a paper which I have a copy of, 1 or 2 copies if you want them, and it's just come out in the International Journal of Design and Nature. This took far more refereeing back and forth than any other paper I've ever written, but you'll find some of the arguments are in there. Let's just talk about feathers of birds. Briefly, I'll mention the alula feather. The alula feather is extraordinary because it's actually needed at low speed, not at high speed. Every single bird has an alula feather. Some have more, even up to 7. And they're on the thumb of the pendactyl limb that I've just mentioned. If birds don't have this low-speed device, they would just fall out of the air when it comes to land. And you can see the alula feather here on American kestrel and a red-tailed hawk. We, of course, use these for Airbus and many other planes. They have forward slats. That, of course, shows the truth, which is that Orville and Wilbur Wright, from then on in 1903, right up to the planes we have today, have actually copied the exquisite design which is shown in birds, including the alula feather, which says a lot about design. But it's not just feathers, the alula feather, it is also the flaps at the back of the wing, which is far more exquisite in birds than in any screw metal system that we have on Airbus A310s and the Boeing 777s and all the other planes that we use today. The exquisite nature of the change of camber, which is exercised by a swan, as shown in this picture, but any bird, has defied being copied yet by aeronautical engineers. If we could actually manage it, Wilbur and Orville Wright managed it in their day, but it was a fairly crude warping system. But that's what birds actually use. They, of course, use a flapping motion as well. Well, you need to realize that feathers, and I'm sure you do realize this, and I'm not in any way thinking that you don't, but I'm emphasizing, Will, that feathers come in all sorts of sizes. You have lesser coverts, you have medium coverts, you have primary, secondary, and tertiary feathers, you have rectrices on the tail. Will here is trying to say, much as I respect him, but I think he's fundamentally wrong, he's trying to tell me that feathers actually have evolved. Now, I'm not quite sure, I haven't been able to find out exactly what his view is on how feathers evolved, but he'll either take one view or the other of the two main thoughts today. Fatuma said some years ago, the feather has the same fundamental structure and development as a reptilian scale. He doesn't necessarily take that view, and I'm not going to put these words into Will's mouth, but that is one view, that scales have changed into feathers. There is another view which I'm coming to in a moment. Now, it's true that keratin is the source material for both feathers and scales, but there the similarity ends. Is this true or is it false, that statement? Feathers, of course, come with a remarkable design feature which has never, ever been shown to be a halfway system in the fossil record. Oh yeah, there's lots of furred creatures, which I'm going to come to in a moment, and there is even examples, clearly, of feathers fully formed. But there is no examples of an in-between structure. These plumaceous feathers are absolutely essential for flight. This is a pigeon's secondary feather, and you can see a barbule system which is coming off the barbs. Now, the feather, I meant to get a feather out of my case here, but I'm just going to do it. A feather has a remarkable construction because you're able to keep a feather attached even when you actually push against it. Why does that happen? The reason is, as I'm sure Will tell you in his biology classes, that there is a barbule system such that left-handed barbules grab the ridges of the right-handed barbules in my diagram. The barbules are only seen under the microscope. My colleague, Professor David Menton, who's going to be speaking tomorrow, actually took this photograph through a microscope, and you can see the barbicules, they're called, coming off the barbule, which actually comes, in my diagram earlier, it would have been coming on the left, and it would be grabbing the ridges coming from the adjacent barb and forming this structure. It's a bit like Velcro, except that you have a sliding mechanism. Feathers are of no use, of course, without oil, and the bird has the remarkable ability to turn its head 180 degrees to get to the preening gland at the base of its spine. Have feathers evolved? No evidence of it. The actual evidence of feathers is actually shown here in the fossil record. Here is a supposedly 25 million year old amber, which is of course just hardened resin from trees. And in there you will find a feather which is identical to a modern feather. You could even chip it open and look at it. Feathers don't show any change over that period. Now, I know full well that we were talking about the Permian, which Will was referring to, but let me come to that in a moment. He mentioned Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx has fully formed feathers. There is absolutely no argument here that those feathers were half feathers. They had claws. People make a lot about that, but you actually get Hoatzin today which have claws. Okay, so let's come to the Chinese examples of supposed in-between creatures. Sinosauropteryx had fur, but there's certainly no evidence of something which is really a feather. The Confucian Saurnis fossil does look as though it did have feathers, and all I would say to you is that it was simply an extinct bird, period. That's all it is. Interestingly, in the area initially in China where they found these fossils, they were supposedly half-bird fossils. You would actually find fish buried amongst these creatures, and it's a little-known fact that actually the burial suggests something not slow, but that's another issue which we're not debating today. We're not debating the actual formation of these fossils. We come to Microraptor gui, which I will accept does have clear examples of feathers, as you can see here. But again, it really is simply a creature which used to live, but we don't have now. It may well have been a feathered dinosaur, and I'm not particularly arguing the toss there. My main point is, does it have half feathers? The answer is no. They are fully formed feathers. Feathers are not as distinct as with the Archaeopteryx, but show every appearance of being feathers. No intermediates. There's another example here of an early Cretaceous creature, which suggests again that it's an extinct creature that we don't have today. That is the only real finding from these fossils. They're either extinct birds or extinct flying dinosaurs, which is a possibility, but they don't show actually any real development, particularly when you put everything together and you find that most of these creatures are in the later period. Now, of course, Will was quite rightly referring to earlier fossils which showed this breathing system, which I'll come to in a moment. There is, by the way, an interesting Triassic fossil of footprints which look distinctly like bird footprints. But I'll leave that point because it's only a single fossil. People have tried to explain it away, but it's a very interesting one which doesn't really fit with the development plan that Will has been suggesting. Scales to feather evolution, well, we've said that that is one option. Then there is this second option, which is that feathers have actually formed by a formation of a follicle which has actually gradually separated and frayed. So a little bit of keratin has grown out of the skin and gradually become a feather. That is the alternative viewpoint. So there's two views, basically. Either scales or this little follicle has become a feather. And this is particularly the article where the morphogenesis of feathers are actually discussed. Let me just quote from my own paper. Alongside the paleontological studies involving the search for clear transitional fossil evidence, there have been attempts to analyze molecular mechanisms in supposed feather branching morphogenesis, and that's this paper which I'm referring to. These authors delivered exogenous, that means genes from outside, exogenous genes, to regenerate flight follicles in chickens and identified a critical protein necessary in feather branching. They suggest that this identifies molecular pathways underlying possible transformations of feathers from cylindrical epithelia, like the little tubes that I was referring to coming out of the follicle, to hierarchical branch structures. And there are two views even within that view, because some say that the rachis evolved, then the barbs, and finally the barbules. But then there is another view which talks about the fusing of barbs to form a rachis. So there is all sorts of discussion about these alternatives. The reality, as I go on to say in my paper, is that there is a fully formed structure of ridged and hooked barbules in all pennaceous feathers, and these are found with precise function and position in the wings of birds. May I say, I should have said pennaceous earlier. I used the wrong word. When we're talking about flight feathers, it's the pennaceous feathers which have this hook and ridged system. Richard Dawkins, whom I may refer to again, talked on a program which was put over by Jonathan Miller in the Brief History of Disbelief about his view as to how a feather formed. I think I have time just to show you a little clip here, so I will do it. And I will break into this interview so that we don't use up too much time. So if I could have the sound when this comes up, please. It's not coming up.
The biologist Richard Dawkins has written at great length about genetics and has committed much of his academic career to answering the questions that arise.
Sorry, I need to get it at the right point. And it's about here. Right, okay.
About that, what
from the novelty.
What was it about that early novelty, before it culminated in something as useful as a feather? Where could natural selection get its purchase upon something which was no more than a pimple?
There cannot have been intermediate stages which were not beneficial. There's no room in natural selection for the sort of foresight argument that says, well, if we got to persist for the next million years and it'll start becoming useful. That doesn't work. There's got to be a selection pressure all the way.
So there isn't a process, as it were, going on in the cell saying, look, be patient.
No.
It's going to be a feather, believe me.
Yes. It doesn't happen like that. There's got to be a series of advantages all the way in the feather. If you can't think of one, then that's your problem, not natural selection's problem. Natural selection, well, I suppose that is a sort of matter of faith on my part, since the theory is so coherent and so powerful.
So, Will, I'm not suggesting for a moment that you accept all that Professor Dawkins says. Please don't think that. But I do actually want to make the point that here is a non-coherency in the detail. And the argument, ladies and gentlemen, is in the detail. Now, of course, one's got to get the overall picture, which Will was bound to show us, of Pangaea forming and eventually splitting. I have no problem, by the way, with continental drift. The trouble is that that was over a much faster period, and he knows full well that that is my position. Let me now come, though, to a different point. Now, this is not you, Will, and I'm not saying that in any way that it's necessarily you in the audience, but there may be just one or two of you saying, the more I think, the more confused I get. Well, let's now turn to a slightly different point, and that is the bone and muscle structure of birds. Bones, of course, of birds are hollow, except for the loon bird, which is a diving bird in New York State, Canada. But 99% of bones of birds are hollow. And of course, it has been found that some hollow structures have been found in fossils of dinosaurs as well. So I accept that it might appear that one has come from the other. Let's just remind ourselves, though, that there are some very important design features in birds which are not explained just by simply saying, oh, that is similar to this, which is all really that Will has said today. There is an important pulley system in birds. It wasn't in Archaeopteryx, that's true, but it is in 99% of birds today, which have this supracoracoideus muscle, which threads through a coracoid bone, and that hole has to be made, if you're going to argue for development over millions of years of evolution, at the same time as a second muscle, which is absolutely necessary to be threaded through that bone such that it lifts the humerus backwards and enables flapping motion to take place from ground. Now, it's true that a bird can fly without the supracoracoideus muscle, but it's absolutely essential if it's going to take off from ground. Special breathing, we've already mentioned. Primarily, reptiles and mammals have this type of system, but I do accept that there does seem to be some evidence that crocodiles have a similar system in some characteristics as birds, but not entirely the same, as we shall see in a moment. Birds have this avian lung, which is a throughput of air, which does not come to a stop. You cannot artificially bring a bird back to life as you might be able to do with our balloon lungs. You can't sort of breathe in and out and hope that the bird will survive. It won't, because a bird has a continuous flow-through lung, and that's what Will was referring to earlier. The blood goes in the other direction, sometimes across. I'm simplifying it in this diagram so you can see. That is a counterflow exchanger, which is the most efficient system in mass exchangers for flowing air to blood, and of course carbon dioxide coming back from the blood to the air. A bird breathes in twice for every complete system of the air going through the lung. The bird breathes in, the air goes to the back, then the air is pushed forwards through the lung as it's breathing out an earlier packet of air. Then it breathes in again, and another packet of air will go to the rear air sac, which is shown here. Then as it's breathed in, the air that we were following now comes from the lung to a front air sac. And finally, when it breathes out the second time, it breathes out that air through its trachea. Now, it may yet be found that crocodiles actually even have that two-stroke breathing system. That's not yet been established. But even if it is established, all it means is that they have a similar system. But it doesn't mean that one has changed into the other. And I'll tell you why you're not going to get very far along that line. Because not only do birds have this avian lung, which for a long while was thought to be only in birds, they also have a very important movable sternum, which isn't just movable on the sternum, but the whole rib system is articulated. And this rib system is not articulated in the reptiles that birds are supposed to have come from. It's a very important point here. And O'Connor and Chessons, of course, have tried to make out that it's all been proved in this particular paper in Nature in 2005. And I quote from my own paper in answer to them. These gentlemen have recently sought to argue that the avian lung was present in some theropod dinosaurs, which was the argument that Will was picking up. This they have tried to infer from the bone design, which shows some evidence of having key cavities similar to a bird bone structure. There may prove to be a similarity, but that there may have been a common breathing system is, of course, no proof of a taxonomical connection between birds and small theropods like velociraptors and so on. Any more so than a hypothetical connection of mammals with reptiles could be established simply on the basis of a common diaphragm ventilating respiratory system. The problem of the derivation of the avian lung at any stage is formidable. This applies wherever one attempts the transition. which, Will, you were trying to say, took place when there was little oxygen in the Permian, or just after the extinction that you take as what happened. So either in some ancestor to birds or in the transition to birds themselves, there is a massive problem, because you can't have the creature breathing in between. This, of course, was shown by a paper which you're unlikely to refer to, by Quick and Rubin. Now, Quick and Rubin are no friends to my position, let it be clearly said, but they have stood against the philosophy that has been expressed by Will. And of course, they're quite right in much of their science. They said in a paper over 10 years ago, recently conventional wisdom has held that birds are direct descendants of theropod dinosaurs. However, the apparent steadfast maintenance of hepatic piston diaphragm lung ventilation in theropods throughout the Mesozoic poses fundamental problems for such a relationship. Let me just break in there. Clearly, they were not anticipating that there might have been found a breathing system in dinosaurs similar to birds. But the argument that they then say still applies to any transitional creature. So we can transfer this argument to any transition which is argued, like Will was saying, in the Permian. The earliest stages in the derivation of the avian abdominal air sac system from a diaphragm ventilating ancestor would have necessitated selection for a diaphragmatic hernia in taxa transitional between theropods and birds. Such a debilitating condition would have immediately compromised the entire pulmonary ventilatory apparatus and seems unlikely to have been of any selective advantage. Now, this argument goes further. The argument has moved on, because now there is a further problem that you have if you argue that birds have come from dinosaur-like creatures, and that's to do with the way they walk. You see, a bird has these air sacs. Now, it may yet be found that there were some dinosaurs which had clearly had an air sac system. I don't think, actually, with respect to Will, that it's really been proved conclusively. But even if it is found, you've still got a problem, because the air sac system for a bird is very much connected with where the thigh bone actually is attached to the main skeleton, as is shown here. And when a bird is walking, that thigh bone hardly moves. It moves a little bit, but the movement is primarily with this bone and, of course, what we would call the ankle. And the whole structure of the way a bird moves is totally different to a reptile. During walking and running in birds, the hind limb movement is generated primarily at the knee and ankle joints. The bird's thigh does not move substantially from its nearly horizontal position. If it did, it would tear the air sacs apart. And that's what Quick and Rubin showed in their more recent paper. And this is the paper which you need to particularly look at if you're interested in really finding out what the evidence is. Can I thank you, by the way, Will, for letting me have that bit more time? I'm grateful. I'm almost through, actually. But can I just show you, here is the articulated rib structure. Now, the articulation is not just at the main sternum, the big breastbone that you carved against last Thanksgiving. It's not that where the articulation is only. The articulation is also, as you can see, in this part of the rib structure as well. And so it's what's called a costal process. This rib cage has to move because a bird doesn't have a diaphragm. It moves its sternum bone and it moves its whole rib cage in order to get its breathing system operational. It has an articulated rib structure system, and that is unique. Birds, I suggest to you, are unique. I would suggest to you, with respect to you, Will, and with respect to all in the audience, that what we really heard earlier was just a sophisticated just-so stories. You have simply said, evolution did it. Evolution did it. but you haven't given the detail as to how an articulated rib structure actually came about. Far from stopping research, my position uncovers more and more detail as we compare carefully the taxonomy of reptiles and birds. And as we go into the detail, the wonder of the design shouts the real truth. Rudyard Kipling wrote a book, How Did the Elephant Get Its Trunk? I suggest you're adding a chapter to his book, How Did the Bird Get Its Wings? And you're just simply generating in a very sophisticated way, and I do respect the mind that has put it together, but just so stories. So I end, and just to remind you that part of the US still has the sovereignty of the UK. You'll find in Bryce Canyon, in the National Park, Utah, Good Queen Victoria's statue. So I end where I began. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andy.
Will. I shake your hand again.
That was wonderful. Do you realize that he spent the whole time talking about a period of time he doesn't believe existed? He only believes there's a 6,000-year history to the earth. So he spent most of his time talking about the sorts of issues that I raise to tell you that, gosh, I don't know everything about it, and gosh, is he right about that. Nobody knows all about that evolution in that period of time. All you could do is have some reasonable conjectures, and I gave those to you, and I don't need to give you those again. But I would say this about his position on birds. The same thing that he said about birds could be said about any organism at all. Any organism is filled with wonderful, beautiful adaptations, and therefore it cannot have evolved either. So his argument is absolutely the same for all organisms. If it has not evolved in the last 6,000 years, then it hasn't evolved. He doesn't talk about the 6,000 years very often. As I say, he spent all his time talking about the other period of evolution. But in fact, indeed, he can talk about what he doesn't believe in just very well indeed. But your argument that I don't know the details of bird evolution, absolutely, you're right. Nobody knows these things right now. But we've been finding out more and more and more, especially of those dinosaurs with the bird-type breathing system. The oldest Saurischian dinosaurs that we know have them. So this is 242 million years ago. So by gum, that's really interesting stuff. I don't know how far it's going to go from there, but it's been breaking in just the last few years, which makes it incredibly interesting. So to my point of view, evolutionists try to claim too much. I'm a historian of evolution. I'm not a working evolutionist, although I'm writing a book about evolution right now that's meant to revise some parts of evolutionary biology. But what I really do care about is trying to be honest with my students. I have a class in evolution that's just about the size of the group of people that's here right now. What a wonderful group of people. And many of them come in very skeptical about evolution. And I welcome every single student in that class. If they're young earth creationists in the class, I'm thrilled to have them be part of the class, and I want for them to talk and participate in the class. That's the way it can be really exciting. And we look not only at evolution, we look at all the implications of evolution. We talk about what does it mean if you take evolution seriously? What does it mean for you? What does it mean for me? It means for me that when I understand evolution, I cannot find a single trace of design in the process. None. No intelligent design whatsoever. I do not see any hope that when I die, I will survive my death. I watched my older brother die. I was holding his hand when he died. And he was there, and then he was gone. I don't believe he survived. He didn't survive anywhere. He just plain died. And that's what all of you will do too, but you won't be in for a surprise. You won't be in for a surprise because you'll just be gone. Now, me, I could be in for a big surprise. I could end up in front of St. Peter. And St. Peter, I know what St. Peter is going to say to me. He's going to say, down there. And that's good because that's where all my friends are anyway. So, not that it would be a great time, but I think it's not going to happen. I'm not worried about it one iota. I think when I'm dead, I'm going to be really dead. And I don't think there is an ultimate foundation for morality that's handed to us by evolution, nor do I think there's ultimate meaning in life. We humans will go out of existence. It won't take that long. We could do ourselves in a hurry. But let's suppose we stick around until the earth turns out to be burned by a sun that turns into a red giant. And, oh, geez, we're going to all get burned up. I think humans, wherever they go, are going to get burned up. And in the end, humans will disappear, just like all other animals and plants in the past. So I see no ultimate meaning in life. You live, you die, you're gone, your family's forgotten, and all your relatives are gone, and pretty soon it's all like that. Then finally, there's no human free will, and we'll talk about that later on tonight. And to me, that's the most interesting implication of evolution that Darwin understood absolutely perfectly. So I think being able to talk about all these issues in our evolution class is absolutely wonderful. Now, Dr. Andy, you really haven't, you told me I hadn't said very much. And I agree. I gave a short talk and I didn't say very much. I just spelled out a scenario that makes some sense. And in the future, I think it'll be filled out and we'll have more evidence, but it doesn't come very fast, this sort of evidence. And I think in time, your position will be harder and harder to defend. But if you pick birds, okay, that's fine picking birds. But I think you could pick any organism under the sun, and all the arguments are exactly the same, and it's God did it, and did it in the last 6,000 years, and I don't really believe in all those earlier times that I talked about tonight. So you got to either, I think you ought to stick to 6,000 years and not talk about 242 million years ago. For my students, when they see the video of the Earth moving around, that little video I showed you, I think that's probably the most impressive thing that they see during the fall semester. They are so intrigued by that. They're intrigued by the way India shoots off from southern Africa and goes boom and goes into Asia. They think that's really neat. And then we show them the fossils that you can find at the time of 70 million years ago. And those fossils are distributed all over Pangaea. It's the neatest thing because they were in touch with each other. And after that, they can't do it. So it's a wonderful scenario for looking at the history of the Earth. And if you believe the Earth is only 6,000 years old, it doesn't work very well. So Dr. Andy and I have very different views. At where I live, out in the country in Virgil, New York, most of my neighbors are creationists. I never use a litmus test of evolution to judge my friends. I never do that because it would be utterly ridiculous for me to behave in such a socially insensitive way. My dear man, I will never dismiss you, ever, ever, ever. Now that I've met you, it's a permanent friendship until I croak.
Likewise. Likewise. Well, I really admire Will's passion for truth. I really do admire that. I'll shake your hand again. I admire that. But you can be passionately wrong. And that's what the issue's about. Of course, I look at that Pangaea video and I say, so what? Because it begs the question of another debate, which is to do with radioactive dating, etc., etc. I don't deny continental drift, but I repeat, it happened over a much, much smaller period. Yes, I accept India is crashing against Asia. Yes, I accept there was a massive splitting of the continents. But of course, it begs the question of flood geology, which is another debate. The reason I've taken the position I have is because that's a separate issue, and I wanted to show you that apart from the age of the Earth, there are huge issues. Let me come on to this one. Because why evolution is at heart scientifically wrong is because of thermodynamics and information. Keep with me, folks. The more you think, the more confused you get. Thermodynamics is not as hard as you might think. I've got another paper in the press which is on this whole issue of thermodynamics and information. This is why you can't have it. Thermodynamics of machines. Any machine, I'm going to use the word machine, is a device which locally raises the free energy. As Will rightly said, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about birds and bats, whether we're talking about human beings, we could have talked about any part of the animals or any other creatures. If you're going to talk about development, you've got to put new machinery, not just at the phenotype level, which is this level, but right down to the genotype level, the molecular level. And that's what I'm just going to illustrate to you. Look, I'm going to be ridiculous, Will. Here's a little machine. I have to put energy in it. I'm using the word machine to define a free energy device. I have put energy into this ridiculous Christmas cracker, and it's moving, right? Why? Because I wound it up. I could have shone the sun for 1,000,000 years on this thing, but it wouldn't have actually increased the free energy of this little device, okay? Now, I had to put the energy in. Now, here's another device. This has got free energy, but of course it's connected to a battery inside, and it makes a fan work. These are machines. Now, just to illustrate the point a little bit further as to where I'm going with this, there are machines, Will, and you well know this. You know this far better than I do. So I'm touching on your area. I'm in fear and trepidation that I may get my terms wrong, so forgive me. But you know as well as I do, far better than me, that there is an ATP motor in every single cell of your body. Oh, sure. And there is in mine as well. That ATP motor only works because there is a system ready to accept the chemicals coming in, ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and convert it to adenosine triphosphate, which is energy. Now, if I carry on this argument, a feather, even though I was delighted to tell you about the structure of a feather, it's not a machine in my definition because it's not using energy as such. But the ATP motor is a machine in the definition that I'm now using. When it comes to photosynthesis, that is an amazing machine, just to illustrate, because there it's using radiant energy from the sun. There is a system ready to make use of that energy, to use that energy and to channel it and through the chlorophyll to make sugar and oxygen. Now, without that machine already in place, the system of chemicals ready to convert the sunlight, you wouldn't have actually got a machine. Professor Dawkins, and I'm not saying, by the way, that you would say the same to me, and he certainly would certainly not have had the attitude that was expressed to me on this radio program. He said, no problem, there's loads of energy in the universe. Machines just will come about without any problem. Now, I'm not saying that you're saying that, Will. But I'll tell you why Professor Dawkins was wrong. This is a machine, right? It's a turbine. If I represent the sun by, oh dear, not getting on very well here now. If I switch this on, right? If there was no solar cell at the top here, I can shine as much energy as I wish coming from another point in the universe, because people talk about open systems. Actually, technically, we should say non-isolated systems, because what I'm referring to, ladies and gentlemen, is the second law of thermodynamics. And they rightly say, well, in an isolated system, that's true. The entropy will never go down locally to raise the free energy that I was talking about earlier. But in an isolated system, it is true, they will say, if I just go back here, that the free energy will never rise. You'll always get entropy increasing, and gradually everything will decay, right? And the answer comes back, well, of course, you've got a non-isolated system. Loosely, we call that an open system, but that's not quite the right term. It's a non-isolated system. And they say energy coming from somewhere else in the universe will actually form a machine locally. Rubbish. Absolute rubbish, scientifically. It's nonsense. You will not get a machine in 1 billion years or 1 billion universes unless you've got a machine already present. You got me? This is the sun's energy. Supposedly, it was said that that is sufficient to make another machine. My point is this: unless you've got the machinery already in place, you will never get new machines. Now, why is this important? Because I'm now coming to information. And the information system, I hope you like my little cartoon in the top right-hand corner, reminding you of the second law of thermodynamics, which you've now are experts at. The machinery which supports the information system in DNA has exactly the same issue. If you're going to form a new functional device at the molecular level, and that's what you need if you're going to move from one creature to another, because genotypically they are different. You are going to, I know, argue about mutations, but in a moment I'm just going to mention mutations, but essentially you are trying to argue that the DNA, which of course Will doesn't know where it came from, that's abiogenesis, but I'm not just talking about abiogenesis here. I'm talking about forming functional machines which will connect with the DNA, which itself has machinery. And the machinery of DNA is such that the nucleotide bonds do not naturally come together. Will knows this. You actually have to increase the free energy in order to form the nucleotide bonds of the horizontal rungs of the DNA ladder. It's also true of the sugar phosphate bonds. It's true of the proteins. All these molecular structures have raised free energies, which means that thermodynamically, they're not going to appear spontaneously. Look at that book, if you wish to, Mystery of Life's Origin by Thaxton and Bradley, if you want to know more details on this. Now, Will knows this, that there are 4 letters, CGAT, standing for the nucleotides, and the triplets of these code for the information in which is then used by single-stranded RNA to go to the ribosome, which makes the proteins from a series of amino acids, which are coded for by the triplets. There is also much more information now becoming evident in the non-coding DNA, which was thought to be junk, but isn't. There is also an incredible spliceosome, which rearranges even the single-stranded RNA, and that's only just beginning to be understood. Now, how does Will understand this? I suggest he's probably put himself in the first camp, that matter and energy is all there is, that information is just, the information I just described, which is the DNA triplet system, is really just an illusion of design. I don't know that that's his position, but I'm pretty sure that that's where he puts himself, judging from his statements earlier. Now, of course, Others have tried to say, well, information is non-material, but it's arisen out of the pea soup, which has gradually developed into the incredible DNA system that we have today. Why is this relevant to birds and bats? I'm talking about the development of new structures in birds that they must have been programmed for, if you're going to talk about evolution, even at the genotype level. And I'm arguing that it doesn't matter what you're talking about, you're not going to get new information apart from what was there to begin with. Rolling a dice is the only answer, apparently, that comes from the camp that Will comes from. Am I finished, by the way? Oh, I'm almost there. Can mutations help us? That's Shannon theory. I'm going to jump and come to my last point here because I'm almost through. And that's this. Basically, Will, you have a big problem even apart from the thermodynamics, because mathematicians have shown that the systems at the molecular level are what we call Turing machines. And a Turing machine is a device which can be completely algorithmically programmable. And we know that no Turing machine can generate information that does not either belong to its input or its informational structure. So no molecular device is capable of generating any information that does not belong to its original input or its informational structure. So I rest my case, even at the molecular level. Thermodynamically, you can't have it.
That concludes the second statements from the parties. We are soon going to enter into the cross-examination phase where each will be permitted to cross-examine the other for 7 minutes. But in preparation of that, you have questions that you've been asked to fill out. If you would pass those to your right at this time, my left, the ushers will be by to collect those so we can present those to them in a few minutes. We will next start with Dr. Provine cross-examining Dr. McIntosh.
Would you please turn on my computer? Thank you. First question for you, Dr. Andy.
Yeah, listening.
Has to do with Genesis.
Yep.
You have written a book which is entitled Genesis for Today.
Yes.
And you take your view of evolution out of that. So everything's happened in the last 6,000 years, and your book is about that.
Yep.
I have a question about that first 2 books of Genesis. Here we go. Here is book 1 of, chapter 1 of Genesis. Pay attention to what they do, everybody. Most of you will learn something from this little job.
Can you just read out the question? Okay, I can read it now. Okay.
That's chapter 1 of Genesis.
Yep.
Now, what happens in chapter 2 of Genesis? That's what's really interesting for me. It has a wholly different theory of origins, and here's how it goes. You know perfectly well how it goes. First, God makes heaven and earth and heaven, but no shrub or grasses. God made man from the dirt. Then he planted a garden in Eden. That's all screwed up from what it was before. God made rivers after that. Then he warned the man about eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge and dying. Now, there's no woman yet. There's no woman yet. Oh, he made all the beasts of the field and named them all. And only then did he get around to making a woman from the man's rib and told him to have fun. Now, my question for you is, what the hell do we have with 2 different theories of creation in the first 2 chapters of Genesis? Which one do you accept?
Thank you, Will. It's a favorite, but there is a very simple answer.
Oh, goody. I'm so eager to hear how you can do it.
I'm sure when you go back to your youth, even in Tennessee, they taught you this, that Genesis 2 is simply putting a magnifying glass on the last day of creation. That's all it's doing.
Oh, no. Because he has to make plants here. He makes plants and animals here. It's quite clear.
Read it
Would you like
carefully.
for me to read you the chapter?
If you
Because
read it-
it's absolutely clear in here.
If you read it carefully, you'll find that God is not saying that he made the flowers and trees actually in that same period as when he made man. It's just simply a magnification of the last day in particular. He's referring, you're right, to the third day, but he's not actually, the whole purpose of that second chapter, the emphasis is, let me tell you the detail of how God breathed into Adam and gave him a living soul. Then how Adam named the animals. This is the emphasis of the chapter. And then, as you rightly say, how God made Eve.
I'm sorry, I don't accept that theory. I understand what you're trying to do is to say that these two stories really just plain fit together really nicely, and I don't see them as being that at all. And I read them all very carefully.
I'm sure you
I
did.
provided exactly what the sequence is, and it seems to me that one is not just part of the other. So I really think there's an issue here, but maybe there's not, and I'm glad there's not for you, but there sure is for me.
A much greater expositor actually referred to them as real events. The Lord Jesus Christ himself. As in the beginning, God made them male and female.
Second question for you. You never answered about the ice cores, and I wish you would now.
Yep. I'm happy to do that. Did you want me to do it now?
Yeah.
To save you time?
You got 2 minutes.
I love the music.
It'll go off.
Michael Ord has written a wonderful book called Ice Cores and the Age of the Earth. Have you read it?
No.
Can I recommend it to you? It may be even on the bookstall at the back. I don't know whether Steve Fazekas has got it. But it's a very interesting understanding of what happened with the ice. What you
Where
may...
was the ice square? In Antarctica
No,
or Greenland?
Greenland, the ice cores.
Okay.
I'm primarily talking about Greenland, but there are other places, but it's mainly Greenland.
Antarctica, they're doing right now.
Yeah, I know. They're doing it in the south as well as in the north. But look, ice core dating suffers from the same issues as any dating system. Because you've got to clearly say that each little phase of the ice is 1 year, and you don't know that. It is well known that under severe conditions, you could get more than one layer. And I'm suggesting to you, Will, that those ice cores can easily be explained by a completely different alternative, which is that there was a massive amount of ice following a massive catastrophe, which you've referred to as millions of years of Pangaea, but I, of course, regard from my position as the flood, right, which was a catastrophic destruction of the world that then was. And after the flood, there was a massive ice age which covered most of the northern hemisphere, a little bit of the south, but as you well know, it doesn't creep so far up. I talk about one ice age, and in that ice age, there was a huge amount of ice being compressed. And that's what gives the appearance of what you think is just 1 year at a time. I don't think it was 1 year at a time.
I understand that it might not be 1 year at a time, but it's pretty close to it, and it comes to about 100,000 years, and that's very hard for you to absorb into a 6,000-year history of the Earth. And I think there's a real problem there, and you just say, I don't think that's good evidence, and that's fine, but it seems to me pretty good evidence.
Sorry, I didn't say it wasn't good evidence. I'm just simply saying that it's a matter of the interpretation of the evidence. It's presuppositions again.
I understand, but nothing that you said would get us off it from it being at least 50,000 years or something like that. Nothing you said would do that.
I disagree.
All right, last question.
Oh,
Okay, all right, okay,
please let
good.
him take some of my time. I took some of his. Let him take some of mine.
Well, all right. It's easy. When Christ returns to the earth in the British Isles, what percentage of people are going to hell?
What? Sorry, what? I think quite...
You are absolutely clear in this book that Christ is coming back.
Certainly.
So when Christ comes back and he comes to the British Isles, what percentage of people are going to hell?
I I do not know.
You don't know? I would venture a guess about 90% of people.
Maybe so, but I don't know.
You wouldn't venture on that.
It's not for me to know the hearts of men.
Okay.
I pray that there will be many more. Can I just ask you some questions, Will?
Sure.
If I may? Could I have my projector, please, my computer? Thanks. Now, I gave you this quote earlier, and you generously let me play it in your time, basically, which I borrowed. Now, I'd like to ask you, how precisely did a feather evolve?
Gosh, I haven't the slightest idea.
I think.
In other words, I showed you a ornithischian dinosaur that had feathers. I don't have any doubt in my mind that those are feathers.
Yeah,
and they're at least 10 million years older than Archaeopteryx. I don't know in detail how feathers evolved. I don't know how it happened before that. I don't know what happened exactly after that. I do not believe that dinosaur is connected directly to Archaeopteryx. One was found in China, one was found in Germany. It doesn't sound right to me. So I don't have an answer. I don't ever hesitate to tell my students in my evolution class that I simply don't have an answer to their questions, and I don't think evolutionists have answered it. There are many, huge numbers. We know far less than evolutionists appear to understand. But that's one of my criticisms of evolutionary biology. I think it's pulling the wool over people's eyes some of the time.
Well, you've heard the statement, the devil is in the detail. You know what I'm going to say? That the design and exquisiteness of God's creative ability is in the detail.
I understand why you say that, but it doesn't make any sense to me because the reason why I don't bite on that is because all the organisms that have gone extinct over the last, let's say, 500 million years is vastly greater than the number of organisms that live now. And every one of them was beautifully adapted, and then they went extinct.
Yes, but
So, to my mind, there's no way you can distinguish between one that doesn't survive and one that does survive. We sometimes like to be able to pretend that we can do that, but most of the time we cannot do that. So that has evolutionists telling stories about evolution.
Exactly.
And I'm against that. I don't believe we should do that. I think we should admit our ignorance when we're ignorant and not make up stories.
the fossil evidence, even on your own timescales, is actually saying, here's a creature fully developed, here's another creature fully developed. There is no obvious connection between the two. Taxonomically, I agree there are similarities, but so what? That's really where it leaves you. Let me ask you my next question, which is this. The thermodynamics which I showed you is an important question. Now, obviously it's into my area and not so much yours, but I would like to ask you, how on earth can you possibly increase the free energies of things which won't naturally come together chemically? You haven't got it. You haven't got the machinery to make new machines. I ask you, where do these new machines that you must have to make wings come from?
Basically, what you're saying is for us to go back in evolutionary history, way beyond the creation of multicellular organisms, way back beyond that. And you're asking us to be very precise how photosynthesis evolved. And I don't think we can do that. I'm sorry. We just can't tell you the story that you want to hear. And besides, you wouldn't believe it anyway because it didn't happen in the last 6,000 years.
Yeah, but that's not the issue, Will, with respect. Look, we'll accept differences on the age of the Earth. I'm arguing that thermodynamically we have a law which says you can't do it. You can't raise free energies without a mind to put machines there to begin with. And all the thermodynamic evidence shows that that's true, Will.
All you said is that there is a problem with being able to do this. We can't go back in time and figure out what happened. That it happened, there's no doubt that it happened.
But I'm talking about science. I'm talking about scientific laws which we know are true.
I understand what you're saying.
And even
I'm not saying it's an easy problem. The origin of DNA is not an easy problem, but I think it did happen.
I think you're struggling, Will, if you don't mind me saying. I think, really, let me come to my last point, which is this. Oh no, I'm not allowed to show that because I didn't show it earlier. I'll come to this. Right at the heart of everything is information. And I showed you this slide, which, by the way, it's well worth reading this book by John Lennox. He's a brilliant mathematician. He's argued with Professor Dawkins. And he rightly says in his book that any machine can be brought down to what we call a Turing machine. Are you familiar with this?
Yes, I am.
Now, Turing was a brilliant chap in UK. You know all of the Enigma project and everything. And he showed that all machinery boils down to being algorithmically programmable. That really is he's using machine in a slightly different way to I used it, by the way. But all your DNA structures which have information in them can be programmed, if you like, down to a Turing machine. And we know that no Turing machine can ever develop anything bigger than what it is to begin with. And this is a fundamental mathematical law. And again, it says mutations will never build a machine. That's basically what it's saying. And yet you're telling me that mutations build new machines.
Have you heard of polyploidy in plants, where plants double their chromosomes? Yes, it's happened in mammals as well. Well, my goodness, they've doubled their DNA. Boom, boom, and then they use it.
Yeah,
and you just told me that couldn't be done, and there it is. Bing, it has happened.
But that's adaptation. That's not new information.
Oh, it becomes new information because it's then used in different ways.
I beg to differ.
Thank you, gentlemen. Do we have the questions? Thank you. Our next format is we will ask each on an alternating basis a question, and I'll step back so you fellows can see each other. The first question will be for Dr. Provine. He will have 2 minutes to answer, and then Dr. McIntosh will have 1 minute to respond to that. And the question is, according to evolution, long before birds existed, the first living cell had to exist. Considering that we now know about the complexity of even the simplest living cell, how could this happen without a designer?
That's a wonderful question, and I really totally sympathize with it. The one-celled organisms live for approximately 3 billion years before they turned into multicellular organisms. So there was a huge amount of evolution in those one-celled organisms. To think of them as being somehow the same over all this time, it was, of course, a big mistake. There's a lot of information about these. The trouble is that even to this very day, bacteria, archaea, and other one-celled organisms exchange their DNA. So I think it's wholly impossible to draw a Darwinian tree of evolution back to the origin of life. That's impossible to do. And what I love to see is evolutionists being a little more direct about that we can't defend a Darwinian tree going back to the origin of life because of all this exchange of DNA that took place for 3 billion years and continues on to the present. So you're asking a really good question, But the problem is finding out enough about evolution that occurred over those first 3 billion years to give a really coherent story of everything we need there.
Thank you. And now you have 1 minute to respond.
Yeah, I have to say this with all respect to Will, whom I really do. I enjoy listening to him and his attempted defense, but Will knows what I'm going to say.
Sure.
Because that is just a story. He's basically saying, until we've found the evidence, we won't know. Well, you can push the boundaries anywhere with this amorphous evolutionary philosophy. If there is a bit of evidence which doesn't quite fit, we'll somehow skirt round it, and we'll move the goalposts, and we'll say, well, eventually somebody will find the evidence. Basically, as I've shown you thermodynamically, and I have a whole talk on thermodynamics and information, it ain't going to happen. It just does not happen. You get adaptations, you get sometimes mutations, doubling up of genes, as was mentioned, but you don't get growth from single cell to multicellular organisms.
Our next question is for Dr. McIntosh. The question is, how do you explain the similarities between fossils and the various layers of Earth and how they clearly move from fish-like creatures at the lowest levels and toward modern species at the top layers?
Okay, it's a very fair question, and I thank you for it. I am not saying that I have all the answers from my position, and I hope I didn't, by my passion, somehow imply that. I am not saying that. I'm just trying to pull up the picture which has it. Here we are. This is what the lady or gentleman is referring to, that in the rock layers, there does seem to be a general progression. I don't know fully the answer to this either, and I thank you for the the very well put question. But may I suggest some things here which may give us a clue? From the evidence, it's not as clear as that picture might make you think that everything is in an order. There are some exceptions. We do find, for instance, fish fossils at the foothills of Mount Everest. We find fish fossils also in the Rocky Mountains. Now, it's true that they may have got pushed up by slow processes in the evolutionary model, but it fits far better with the idea of catastrophe. And may I say that the fossils themselves sometimes have soft-bodied parts. A massive octopus was found in the Cretaceous, which doesn't properly fit with this progression. So you need to be very careful about thinking that that progression is always what you find. There are peculiarities in the findings, but it is true that generally it tends to be the sea fossils first. Hardly surprising, because it was an inundation from a huge flood, which primarily caused the rocks leading up to near the tertiary, I would suggest. In other words, most of it is flood deposit.
Thank you. Response?
Don't have anything to say to that one.
Dr. Provine, you mentioned in your opening statement that the Earth's continents took hundreds of millions of years to move to their current positions. Your conclusions are based on how fast the continents are moving today. Could the continents have moved at a much faster rate in the past?
Yes, indeed, that's true. Indeed, if you go back beyond 300 million years, there were other Pangea-like conglomerations of pieces of land, and they did not occur at exactly the same rate that the most recent one has since 300 million years ago. I could show you one from 600 million years ago, and it would look very different between 600 and 300, and it would look very different. And the movements are not at the same rate. Yes, there are records of that are quite clear, and the movements are not always like the very last 300 million years. That's a good thought.
Response?
I'm not going to say a lot, but simply to say that, of course, my position is that I don't deny the movement of the Earth's plates. I think it's a very good model, but I think it's on a much faster scale. And the radioactive dating actually does indicate, particularly the helium in the granites, which should have diffused from millions of years ago, it's still there, indicates that the rocks are not consistently radioactively dated. When you go into the detail, it's the detail which tells you that there are suspicions that the radioactive dating is not correct.
Dr. McIntosh, your next question is, since creationists allow for some function of natural selection, why not allow for natural selection to generate new species of living things?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. Why can natural selection not be the engine to change one creature into another? I'm reinterpreting what you've asked. That's the way I'm taking you to the question. It cannot be the case because I've already shown you that actually natural selective pressures, perhaps I implied it rather than actually showing you, but natural selection reduces the normal information content. Unless you start appealing to mutations, filling up the funnel at the top, which is what Dawkins says in his book, A Devil's Chaplain, and I imagine will say something very similar. Actually, that doesn't work, as I've already shown you. Mutations don't actually increase functional information. Natural selection is a real selective pressure. It's just like artificial selection. And Charles Darwin knew all about this. He artificially selected for pigeons, and he could get all sorts of varieties. We do it today with Angus cows and in Britain, which for beef, and we have Jersey cows for milk. Once you've done that, you'll never get an Angus cow from a Jersey cow because the selective pressure, in this case artificially, has removed things from the original information base. Will doesn't like talking about gene pools, but to be frank, I think it is a gene pool which is restricted once you have a natural selective pressure upon it. So you don't actually go up in complexity, you actually, if anything, move down. You lose information.
I would say that natural selection and speciation have very little to do with each other. The crucial aspect of speciation is isolating mechanisms that prevent the organisms from breeding together. And their rise has very little in a direct way to do with natural selection. They just happen if the species are separated enough for long enough, they may or may not appear. We know very little about speciation. My argument is that the book on speciation would be like the book on what I know about women from Nashville, Tennessee. It's a man who published that every year, and you open it up, and it's a blank book. That's what the book about speciation is like. And when you buy a book on speciation, you can better believe that the examples of speciation in action will be few and far between.
That's a very fair answer.
Next question is for Dr. Provine. If Andy were an old Earth creationist, would we have a stronger case in your view?
I couldn't quite hear what you were saying because of the bouncing.
He wants to know if you're an old Earth creationist instead of a young Earth creationist.
Okay.
Would that make your position more palatable to me?
Okay.
Correct.
I guess in a way it would be more palatable to me because it means that you could really talk about these older periods of time as if you believed in them, because I know darn well you don't. So it's kind of funny talking with you about things you don't believe in. And so I think that would make for a more natural communication. But the argument would be that God was involved with this process and somehow guided it. And I see absolutely no evidence that that's true, and I think we would end up disagreeing just about as much as we do right now.
You have a response?
Well, funnily enough, I agree with about 70% of what Will has said. You end up with a nonsense if you try and put God in it, because God declared in the scriptures is not one who is creating by process. He creates by his word. And of course, Will doesn't accept this, but I believe in Christ, who just by merely speaking to a dead body, he rose again. And he was able in a moment to give eyes to a man who was born blind. And it's that creative force which is in operation in Genesis 1. Therefore, it's a nonsense to try and say that God is somehow involved in an evolutionary process. That's from my position. And equally well, from an evolutionary position, of course, Will, I agree with. It would be a nonsense because evolution flows from an atheistic mindset primarily. And he knows that that's the case. And it fits beautifully with his presupposition.
And our final question is for Dr. McIntosh. Since your Christian faith compels you to believe the book of Genesis, doesn't your faith cause you to ignore the evidence of science?
Not a bit of it. Being a creationist unfolds beautifully a most coherent view of the science. I stand exactly where Faraday stood. He said these things that he had done, he was talking about electromagnetism, he wasn't talking about evolution. He says these things lead me to think of him who has made them. For it is said by an authority far above even that which these works present, that the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. Michael Faraday is probably the greatest scientist of the 19th century. I put him obviously way above Darwin. He dealt with experimental science. And his thinking of knowing that God had made the world beautifully unfurled what the world really was. Similarly, James Clerk Maxwell had the similar view of the world around him. Even Einstein, who didn't believe in the God of the Bible in the 20th century, talked about the harmony of natural law. He knew that to believe in a higher force, in that case, for him, it was like a Spinoza view of God. He didn't believe in a transcendent God. But even he could see that this gave him a sense of beauty as to the world around him. Science beautifully fits with a creation position.
I don't think, though, that that's true at all. And were I you, I couldn't live as myself because I would have so many just blatant contradictions in my life. But you have managed to do it all, and I admire you for it, but I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you for saying that.
It is now time for our closing statements. Dr. Provine will go first.
I really understand Dr. Andy's position better now. It is really true that he follows Scripture first and foremost, and the science has to be in tow after that. That I could never do. I really want to pay attention to science and what it tells to me first and foremost, and then after that, I'm very interested in all the issues connected with evolution, as I told you before. I know one thing is for certain. I don't get on my knees and pray to evolution. Evolution is a process that doesn't care about me at all. It gives me no sense of meaning in life that I was produced by a process that doesn't give a damn about me. That doesn't do a thing for me. Where do I get meaning in my life is from the people in my life. My sons, my former wife, whom I still love and still loves me. All these people in my life, my students, I have the most wonderful meaning in my life. It's just, my life is crammed with meaning, but it's not ultimate meaning. And so when life comes to an end, boom, it comes to an end, and I'm here today and gone tomorrow. Do you think that bothers me? Not one bit. So to me, evolution is no friend to me. I don't think of it in a sweet sort of way at all. I know it produced me, but I know darn well it doesn't care about me, so I don't think about it the way Dawkins does. Dawkins thinks about evolution as something that's just great stuff. To me, it ain't great stuff at all. It produced us, but that's all there is. Thank you.
I've been at pains to say that actually, of course, I never denied that the statements that Will has made, that I do believe the Bible and I do accept a young earth. But let me say this, that the science that I've presented to you and to you, Will, actually drives you to a logical alternative. And you know deep down, you won't admit it, perhaps to me ever, but I think in the quietness of your own room, you might admit that the science actually does point, as Romans 1:20 tells you, the invisible things of God are clearly seen. The feather shows you exquisite design, which could not possibly, for thermodynamic reasons and all the reasons I've given, actually have come about by random mutations and natural selection or some sort of other evolutionary idea. The science tells you with a strong signpost that there is a creator. And I say it strongly, Will, not because I don't love you as a person, but because it's true.
I can't see it.
I know you can't, but there is a reason why you can't see it. The reason is not because necessarily Michael's position you hold, who says this, Michael Ruse, evolution came into being as a kind of secular ideology, a secular religion, a fully fledged alternative to Christianity with meaning and morality. Will has just said that's not his position, and I accept that. What's your position? Well, you were co-author to this, so it still might not be actually your position, judging from what you've just said. But this article, which you co-authored, says the most important feature of evolutionary biology is its integrated view of humankind's place in nature that easily lends itself to a deeply satisfying metaphysics based on materialist principles. Now, I have presented to you that rather than complex systems coming about by random effects, which is really what you've got to appeal to, that a mind and intelligence has actually constrained the local thermodynamics and all the wonderful machinery to be made as is, and I'm not talking about the fixity of species. There's definitely been adaptations, I accept that, but they've been essentially mainly downhill, loss of things, not gain of new machinery. My position, as Will knows perfectly well, is that everything is consistent with in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That's Genesis chapter 1. And in John chapter 1 it says, in the beginning was the Logos, which isn't just talking spiritually, it's talking about the word, the founding principle, which supports everything that has been made. Who is the Logos? Or what is the Logos? That chapter goes on to say, the Lord Jesus Christ is the one who made everything. The greatest thing that he did there wasn't creation. It's when he redeemed me by dying on the cross for my guilt. That is the greatest thing that God ever did. May God be honored. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Dr. Provine, Dr. McIntosh, audience. You've upheld our rules. We appreciate that. At this time, if Pastor Lucas, please come forward.
You may not realize or understand fully what I'm going to say to you, but you have participated and benefited from a very rare privilege in being here today to hear these two men. I almost gave up on the prospect of having this particular debate when one after another, every evolutionist just made it very clear that he thought or she thought that this was something that just should never happen, never would happen. And this guy has no fears of people, but his friend, I'm a little concerned of some of the heat that he might take for his willingness to be here. And then not only his willingness to be here, but the kindness he has shown to all of us while he has been here. Thank you so much, Will. And to Andy, I can only say, I'd gladly give back your tea. I can't stand the stuff. Folks, we're going to take an extended break. If I could, before you get up and move up, if I could run some things by you. Remember, the one thing these two guys could agree on is tonight is daylight savings. Please turn your clock ahead 1 hour. Tomorrow morning here at Grace Community for the 9 o'clock Bible study, Andy will be teaching. So for those of you who don't have other commitments tomorrow morning, we invite you to come hear Andy at 9 o'clock. We will be resuming for the second debate promptly at 7 p.m. In the meantime, the upstairs cafe will be open to serve beverages if you'd like to purchase hot or cold. As I said earlier, the local restaurants have been alerted that they might get a flood of business, and so they should be ready for you. If you choose to bring your food back here, you are welcome to do that and take that upstairs, but we would ask that you keep the auditorium clear. We don't want traffic in and out of the auditorium because there's some things that will be taking place here